Hi there, it's Rachel Thexton with Rachel Thexton Connects. I am standing in Fort Myers, southwestern Florida. And right where I'm standing, I'm sure there's a story to this land, to this community, to the people who live here. My next guest, Inder Nirwan, Kahani Pictures, tells stories via the visual. He is a filmmaker and has amazing things to share about his process, his background, and so much more. I introduce to you on Rachel Thexton Connects, Inder Nirwan with Kahani Pictures. All right, so today is an exciting day for me, and I think it's going to be an exciting day for you too if you're tuning into this episode. I am thrilled to welcome to the podcast Inder Nirwan. He is an extremely talented filmmaker. He is owner of Kahani Pictures, and his films are documentaries, storytelling. I'm going to let him talk about it. Inder, welcome to Rachel Thexton Connects. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Inder and I were introduced by a mutual friend, and I had a look at his website, and I've mentioned this many times on the podcast, Inder, but I'm quite a crier. And that means like happy tears. Like I'm just very, did they just come at everything? So something happy. My son said at the doctor, my mom's the strongest person I know. And I burst into tears and everyone's confused. What's wrong? So obviously, when I look at your website and the films that you make, my husband thinks that there's been a death in the family because I'm bawling my eyes out, but it's emotion. And it's just from what you've created and this talent that you seem to have been born with, because the skills you learn, the talent, it has to be there, I think. But let's rewind it just a little bit for those who don't know of you, to just kind of get a little background on you. You have a 30-second video on your Instagram where you basically introduce who you are and your story in 30 seconds, which is really hard to do. I actually used it in a training session yesterday. So have a look, listeners, at that 30-second video. It gives a very short and concise but detailed idea of Inder's backgrounds. You have this talent for filmmaking. You have a complex background, a lot of things going on there, like all of us do. Can we start by kind of getting to know you and the beginning of your story? So, you say you're the first person born in Canada. What was that like growing up here? And how did your experience in life start here in Canada?
For sure. Well, thank you for all the kind words. Making people cry is a key performance indicator for us at Kahani, so I'm glad that we're making that happen. But no, I mean, I really do appreciate that because it's not too often that we get to hear feedback on like the body of work, because so much of the work that we do is condensed into those engagements. So like we have a lot of it's commissioned, we have clients, and so sometimes we don't even see where the films go or how they're being seen, and we're just kind of done and dusted, and then maybe we'll hear about it after the fact. But for someone to watch like the collection of the films we've made and then feedback on that is actually quite special to me at least. So thank you.
Wow.
Um, yeah, okay, so beginning at the beginning, huh?
Yes.
I mean, yeah, my family is from Punjab, India, and just to kind of give you a little bit of context setting, because I don't know if you or your listeners know the extent of what the sort of Punjabi diaspora here in Canada, like how that came to be and what the backstory is, but it's a bit topical right now because you see stuff in the news, right? You see like
Yes.
the involvement of like Indian agents in like political parties, and there's the separatist Khalistan movement and all that. So my family was actually involved in much of that. Basically, what happened was post British decolonization of the India region, where they split up India and Pakistan into two separate countries. That was done to kind of create like space for the majority religious groups. So there's the Muslims, there were the Hindus, but then there were also the Sikhs.
Right.
The Muslims got Pakistan and the Hindus got India, and the Sikhs were kind of left in the dark as to where they were meant to go, especially because prior to colonization, they had their own homeland. There was the Sikh nation that existed before, and it was annexed by the British when they came in and colonized the area. And so, all that's to say, the Sikhs, when they found a home in the Punjab region of India, the state of Punjab, they started to realize that they were being treated quite like second-class citizens. There was a lot of economic disparity. There was a lot of like even things like access to the irrigation to their farmlands was being restricted by the Hindu majority government, which
Oh,
even to this day is a very nationalistic government. So they don't really, encourage other religious groups to find footing in India.
okay.
And so that led to a lot of turmoil and then violence, right? There was a burgeoning separatist movement coming out of the Punjab region. And the leaders of those separatists, in particular, the one guy, Bhindranwala, he was a very charismatic, very like charming and strong leader of this opposition. And he started to amass a group of very angsty young men that were looking for somewhere to put all their energy.
Mm-hmm.
My mom, she grew up in a village that was built at the base of a temple that was like an ancient holy site in Sikhism. And so the leader of that separatist movement, he would often visit the village as like a part of his sort of pilgrimage, but also like a way that he was connecting with the people. He would go to these special places. And he wound up recruiting my mom's brothers, my two uncles, into his personal bodyguard kind of regime.
Oh my.
And so as tensions continued to, fester, there it came to a real critical mass in the late 80s, or the mid 80s rather, where the separatists had fortified themselves in the Golden Temple. It's this like really beautiful, it's probably like if you know any imagery of Sikhism, you
Yes.
think of the Golden Temple. They had kind of stationed themselves there and were building a small militia to kind of fight back against the Indian sort of oppressors, as they would say. And the Indian army or the Indian government decided to smoke them out. So they actually sent the army in to kind of wean these people out. And it turned in what was meant to be like an overnight raid, turned into like a 6 day long, full-on military conflict style event where
Wow.
they eventually brought in like artillery and blew up really, a lot of the sort of outside structures of the Golden Temple area. And then within that, they were able to kill the leader and with him, one of my uncles as well.
Oh,
And so all this backstory is to kind of lead up to the point that when my family moved out here, they did so because after the event at the Golden Temple happened, the Sikhs were able to codify a retaliation. They actually assassinated Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and then in retaliation to that, there was these what they called the riots, which was basically kind of a no holds barred mass genocide against the Sikh people throughout major cities in India. And it was in recognition of like how unsafe India had become for the Sikh people and how there was like such a bleak future that many of them decided to leave the country. And so amongst them were my parents. And
okay.
when they fled India, they didn't really know where they were going, and they didn't necessarily look to places like Canada as like some kind of, hopeful future. It was just a way to get away from the violence.
Right.
So when they came here, it wasn't so much out of like a romanticization of like Canadian life and culture and all that. And so I was born a year after they moved here, and I was
Okay.
the first in my family to be born in Canada. And so you can imagine what that must have been like, where, immigrant parents, they don't speak the language, they don't really want to speak the language. They want to
Right.
find a way to conserve like their own heritage, and they had such pride in where they come from and what they fought for that coming here and assimilating into the culture just didn't, it wasn't a high priority for them. So for me
Okay.
growing up, I was kind of caught between these two worlds, right? I had my parents and what they stood for, which was kind of confusing to me because it just didn't fit in with what I was seeing around me. And then there's like all this Western culture and all my friends who didn't, I looked different from because the clothes I wore, and I had like my hair tied up in a turban, and so, I grew up when I kind of got to my adolescent years, we moved to an area where there were more Punjabi Sikh people. It started becoming more normalized, but I think a lot of that sort of foundational kind of personality building, experiences were built out of this like dichotomy of like belonging and not really understanding where I fit in. And so I think that was really imperative to my journey as a storyteller because I think that, you know, in going back and learning about those experiences, speaking to my parents, speaking to elders and others in my community, and starting to really understand where they're coming from, how the trauma is being dealt with throughout, as families grow and as the community grows, it's really helped me to recognize that notion that people's stories run deep and they're complex, and no one is the sum of what they seem on the surface. And I
Yeah.
think that that's really helped inform my approach to the type of storytelling that we do at Kahani, which is very like personal. It's matters of the human heart. It's how, we can search for those moments that people can connect with and make them cry.
Yes. Yes. Mission accomplished. Yes. Wow. So you do believe that, these experiences as a youth, kind of being caught between these two worlds, as you describe, and also likely, feeling some of that tension from your family, from what had taken place, the loss of your uncle and other tragedies and having to leave the country. Do you think that that kind of brought more empathy into your being? Because there has to be empathy, I believe, to create the kind of work that you do.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all related, right? I think that the journey that my family's been on, it's not unique, but it is our journey, and there are nuances to it that are, especially ours. And I think one of those nuances was particularly with my father recognizing this string of violence that's existed both internally and externally within our family. There's obviously the big world events that happened in the 80s and everything that led up to it, but then also like the situation that like our family and many others that come from that time and place was that economic hardship that led to people not having jobs, that led to alcohol abuse, that led to domestic violence, that led to all these things that my father was experiencing at home too. And so I think um, what that he came to a recognition that violence and sort of fronting with anger is not the answer to building a deeper relationship with me and my brother,
Hmm.
especially because we were starting to get caught up in quite a lot of influence from our Western lifestyles.
Yes.
So when he turned that around and led with empathy, that really brought us together and created this wonderful bond between the three of us now that I think is just
Hmm.
stronger than ever. And I think that's really where my, sense of empathy stems from, was
Wow.
his example.
Yeah, that's very cool. You must be very, very proud of your father because he could have taken that in a much different direction.
Yeah, I mean,
Awesome.
he is an absolute gem. I should probably do a film about him.
You should. You
Yeah.
should. I'd love to see that. Um, so your family, obviously a big part of things. You describe in this 30-second, you describe a lot in 30 seconds. I don't know how you did it. I'm going to have to ask you some tips on that. I can't get anything into a minute. Um, but you describe kind of this burnout. It seems kind of like trial and error of where you belong in the film space or professionally, and where your space is and where kind of you feel right. Um, how did you kind of end up in this storytelling space, documentary space that you're in now, versus, for example, working corporate or, being a director in Hollywood? What led you to this place? And can you describe that kind of burnout period?
When I made the commitment to wanting to become a filmmaker, it was very much wanting to be that director in Hollywood. My heroes were all the typical like Scorsese, Tarantino, Spielberg, like that affair. And so I was really keen, right? I got into the camera union here, the local 669. I was working on camera for quite a while, and then I was working in post-production for quite a while, and starting to feel the realities of like film set life and culture versus the romantic idea of what I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
Where it was like, and especially like, throughout my high school years, I was making films, and in film school, I was making films always with friends in this like real camaraderie kind of uh, circumstance. We're all just having fun and solving problems together and making silly films and what have you. But then, yeah, when I got into the industry and started to really explore my opportunities there, I started to lose that sense of creative like connection to the work we were doing.
Hmm.
Everything always, it's very, I don't know if you know much about film sets, but it's quite rigid in terms of like hierarchy and structure of like,
Yeah.
especially if you're working in a department like camera, right? You got to work your way up from being like the trainee to the second assistant to the first assistant to the camera operator. And if you're the second assistant or if you're the trainee, don't you dare talk to the cinematographer, right? You got to go up the chain. So it's that kind of stuff.
Quite
And
thankless as well, right?
yeah, and well, it not only it's more than that, right? Like they would like haze you if you're a beginner, and sure, that's kind of fun, but it's also like quite intimidating and off-putting for a lot of people.
Yeah.
And and so there was that aspect of it. There was also like, just yeah, moments of really feeling like, the times when producers are yelling at you, or we're running out of time to get this shot and everyone's high stress and we're standing in mud on a late Friday knowing that we have to start again on early on Monday. So you really have like one day of the weekend to do all your life things. And so that started to chip away at me, and I just was coming to terms with that being the reality of film. But then what really kind of took me out of it was I was actually working on in post-production on a reality TV show about like tow truck drivers on the Coca-Cola. It's called
Okay.
Highway Through Hell. It's on Discovery.
Yes.
I still think it's running. But when I was working at GPM, I was the assistant editor on the show, and we were working on the pilot episode. And I happened to be there late on a Saturday, kind of trying to get ahead of the following week. And the showrunner was the only other person in the building. He was editing the pilot episode of this like flagship show for the production company. And he saw that I was sitting there, and he was like, "Hey, I just finished this edit. Why don't you come take a look?" And no one's seen this before. I literally just finished the first episode. I'm like, okay, so big deal, right? The showrunner is asking you to take a look at something. So I went and sat down. He kind of stood over my shoulder the entire time. It's like an hour-long episode. And I sat and I watched what happened. I kind of jotted some ideas down and gave him notes. And he was quite impressed by that. He was like, "Wow, you really know what you're doing. You know what you're talking about." And I was like, "Yeah, I care about this stuff." Um, and then I came back the next day and decided to quit because I kept thinking about what I had just seen. And I didn't realize at the time that I had like a moral conviction about these sorts of things, but it really hit me, and I guess I do, right? And basically what had happened was in the show, the in the like the third act of that episode, the tow truck drivers and the camera crew with them, they wound up being the first responders to a scene of an accident where
Okay.
they discovered that somebody that was involved in the accident had passed away on the scene.
Wow.
And so the showrunners decided to put that into the show as a means of like demonstrating like how harrowing this job is. And it's like this big climactic, dramatic event that they felt was like the real sort of like linchpin to sell the show. And I just couldn't stop thinking about this poor guy and imagining his family sitting at home flipping through the channels. They find this TV show that reminds them of their dad, and turns out it is him. Not that they ever named who
Mhm.
the guy was or anything like that, but still, right? It's just like
Yes.
disrespect, right? And I couldn't do it. I was like, I don't want to be in an industry that exploits people like that. Like we're doing this for money, and like,
Hmm.
this it's just didn't feel right. And so at that point, I had a very serious lapse in my commitment to the film industry and decided to try something else. Uh,
Okay. How did you then shift? I mean, how do you make that shift?
Well, I needed a job, and the only skill set I have is filmmaking. So I
Yeah.
was just responding to like random ads on Craigslist for like gigs, and there happened to be an ad that said, "Do you dream of being the next Steven Spielberg?" And I'm like, "This is so cheesy. Let's check it out." And it was an ad. This like local soap company was looking for a videographer. So I thought, hey, okay, maybe I'll just go in and it's like a summer job. And then next season, when new shows are hiring, I'll consider what I'm doing. The small soap company turned out to be Lush Cosmetics, which, unbeknownst to me, was like a global phenomenon, especially it was like just really blowing up at that time.
Yes.
And it was unlike anything I've seen before, in terms of just like it was such a bootstrappy small team kind of vibe, but this massively growing influence in the world, really. And they didn't really even know what they wanted. They just knew that they have to be on the internet, and video was just starting to become a real thing on like YouTube, and Facebook had just purchased Instagram at the time, so they were launching some video features. So like they knew they had to make videos, but there was no precedence. No brand was doing this yet. So they literally just gave me a camera and they're like, what can you do? And we just had fun with it. We just made a bunch of videos. I wasn't taking it seriously at all because I was like, I'm probably going to not work here after a month. And we made some videos, and one of them wound up going viral. It was like and it was interesting because it was like a protest video to, at the time, there was the Enbridge pipeline that was coming in.
Okay.
And Lush has this real activisty kind of, angle to it,
Yes.
whereby they were very openly against the Enbridge pipeline project and wanted to do something. And I think the video was that like Enbridge had put out a commercial on TV that was like playing on every channel, to talking about how great the pipeline project would be for the community. But the animation was like really poorly done. And I couldn't help but laugh. I'm like, I bet you anything someone charged them like millions of dollars and I could do this in an afternoon. And they were like, "Can you?" I'm like, "Yeah." So we came up with this idea of doing the exact same animation, but talking about how awful the project would be. And
Hmm.
people loved it. And like there was like local movie theater chains were picking it up and showing it like as a pre-screen kind of thing. And then it was like
Wow.
it was going, yeah, some media picked it up and it did really well. And so at that point, they're like, "Who are you?" And they're like, "Look, here's a camera, here's a credit card. Go do what you do
Oh, what a dream.
and make it look good and just put our name on it."
Yeah.
And that was my job for like 8 years. And it was
Okay.
amazing. Absolute dream job. And within that, starting to recognize that, yeah, there's really cool work that the company's doing that nobody knows about. Like the way that they do their buying is like, uh, upending like uh, gender issues in northern Ghana, where like there's a women's collective making shea butter that sells it to Lush, and Lush buys it at a premium price to support the women who are now making more money than their husbands. And so it's like upending the fabric of society and giving power to women. And nobody's talking about this. Right?
Wow. They need PR.
Right. Well, because that wasn't the point, wasn't to talk about it. The point was just to do it. And
Right.
so I was like, well, this makes for way more interesting. That's a really interesting story. Why,
Yeah.
so I went out. So they just sent me, they're like, go. So they put me on a plane to Africa and I flew out there and made this little video for them and brought it back. And it was just like this amazing experience. And I was like, there's something really interesting here. We should do more of this. And so that became a real passion project, was to do what we now call it like impact storytelling, but basically going out and creating these films and storytelling experiences that demonstrate the impact that the company was involved in, and doing it in a way that's not like performative, like just a bunch of numbers on a screen and old white people talking, but rather let's go
Hmm.
to those communities and let's talk to this mother whose life we've just changed because you're buying shea butter at $1 more than everybody else. And so that became the sort of precipice of like rediscovering my passion for filmmaking and doing it with stories that I can feel proud of. Stories that are also larger than myself. Like, in no way could I ever imagine coming up with something like this and writing a screenplay around it. Like I have to go discover it. And then it also helps me to exercise like all of my sort of filmmaking itches that I have, right? Scratch those itches because like it's always challenging. You're in different scenarios all the time. And in particular, you're working with people that are not film people. So being able
Right.
to build that trust with them and also to keep myself in check on how to tell these stories without it becoming this like exploitative, mission of like wanting to inject my own ideas into the story through the filmmaking. Like it's been a very humbling way to grow as a filmmaker.
Wow, that's amazing. The reason I mentioned PR, well, is a bit of a joke because I do PR, but mostly because I always think that PR around activity like that is great because it it shows the buyer. I mean, I think that buyers nowadays really do care about things like that, a lot of them. And when they know that, like I didn't know that about Lush. I
Yeah, most
knew
people,
that they
yeah.
branded themselves that way, but I didn't know the authenticity of it.
Yeah. And I mean, we did have a PR team and they were wonderful people. We had a whole, brand marketing team. But I think
Mm-hmm.
that it's one thing to just like say, we should do PR around this. And then there's a dangerous, I think,
There's a
notion
fine line.
to again like the idea of extracting details of a story because it makes for good PR versus telling a story in an authentic way that it feels real and it feels natural because it is.
Yeah.
And I always draw it back to like you have to have that right intention as to why you're doing something. And sometimes that was the challenge with some of the more inexperienced PR people that we would bring in that they might be junior or whatever and they see this juicy headline idea without wanting to do the depth of like, no, you got to go there and talk to the women and understand why this is important to them, right? Let's not make any assumptions here. And so
Mm-hmm.
that would be kind of my like advice to people that think that this is like interesting and cool. It's like there's a lot of work that goes into doing it right.
Yeah, it's the sad reality is that, clickbait, this whole idea of a lot of people, well, some PR people know that, pitches that have that clickbait angle will land with some outlets, which I guess is success in some people's eyes, not in mine, but uh, it is a very fine line, and it's I think probably one that you also walk. I walk with clients as well when talking about philanthropic work and things like that. So it's interesting, but so that's how. So then from there, you were off to Kahani Pictures. Sorry,
Yeah.
you.
So yeah, eventually Lush got too big for my taste. They started adding a lot of middle management, and when it turned from do what you want to no, first you got to like build a brief and tell us what it is, and then we're gonna go turn it through the machine and serve it back to you, and it's like a really dulled down version of the original idea. I was like, this is not how I want to work. But then I also started to clue into like, Lush had set this example. They started becoming known for that kind of impact space that they were taking up, and a lot of other new brands and a lot of even older brands wanted to be doing more of that. And a lot of consumers, I think, are putting brands under pressure to be doing the right thing. And so um, I started to see the patterns that, hey, it's not just Lush anymore. There's a lot of other people. And if Lush is willing to pay me to do this, then maybe a lot of people are willing to pay me to do this. So I decided that it might be a good idea to try to launch this as like a service offering in the business community. And so that became Kahani Pictures.
Amazing. And I read in your bio that the word kahani is actually in Punjabi the word story. Is that correct?
Mhm.
Okay, so that's
Yeah,
so
it lands kind of between like story and fable.
okay. So why was that important to you? Was that something intentional that you just really wanted to incorporate, your culture into the brand, or was that just kind of, it just landed?
Um, I mean, a little bit of both, right? I always kind of laugh, like, I don't know why there's like production companies in particular just have like the silliest names. Right? If you just, and I'm like, there's like, it doesn't really feel like there's a lot of thought put into them, or there's like anything that's telling me about who they are, what they do.
Right.
And so it was important to me that, there was some kind of reflection of who I am, where I come from, and what we're about. And Kahani seems to just encapsulate all that, especially if you ask like another It's actually Kahani is like a taken from Sanskrit, I think. So it's actually the same word in Hindi, Punjabi, um,
Oh,
it's like Arabic and Urdu, but I think like it's a word that permeates like across many languages. And
okay.
anyone that does speak one of those languages, as soon as they hear it, they're like, "Oh, I get it." They're like, I know everything I need to know about you just because that's your name."
Wow. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah,
If you, I don't know if you're a tattoo person, but if you were, that would be a natural tattoo. Kahani. That's very
yeah.
interesting. Um, I want to ask you about something. Years ago, when I was a teenager, I watched the film American Beauty. I don't know if people remember that movie or not. I can't even remember the actors in it. Have you seen it?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So there's a scene in the film where they're watching this plastic bag and it's floating through the air. The wind is blowing it around and it's just there's nothing to it really. There's no script. It's just this young boy or teenager who takes video and he's got this plastic bag and it's floating and it's floating and it's falling and it's floating and it's got a dynamic of almost life to it. And they accompany it by music, of course, and watch it. And it makes him very emotional. And obviously, me, I'm very emotional as well watching it. And I found that scene so incredibly powerful. A plastic leg blowing in the wind with no words. How is that possible? You know, and so I just I wanted to get your kind of your thoughts on that scene first of all because I thought what an interesting scene to ask you about. And is there a moment from someone else's film, whether it be documentary or fiction, that has stuck with you like that one has stuck with me?
Um, for sure. I mean, it's been a long time since I've seen American Beauty, but I recall the scene with the plastic bag, and I think it's a pretty famous shot, right? Because it does encapsulate so much of, I think, I might be getting this wrong, but I think the intention with that scene is to kind of demonstrate just like the fleeting nature of like life and existence is that we might as well just be plastic bags floating in the wind.
Yes.
And there's I think at the time especially there's just like a lot of like um, anti-culture kind of existential dread that existed in like the late 90s and early 2000s that people really connected with it, that was just represented in this idea of like it's all for nothing. And I think that's kind of what the plastic bag represented. I might be wrong, but that's what maybe.
No, you're right. And let me stop you there because that's so interesting. And it indicates exactly what you do because I could never have described it in that way. You know, the way I described it was very, very different. People would really have no idea what I was talking about. But when you described it, it was, you know, there was a couple, they were unhappy, they were in a cookie cutter neighborhood, everything was status quo,
Yeah,
but
well, the whole
everyone was
movie's
miserable.
about Kevin Spacey trying to like find some kind of semblance of meaning to his otherwise like dreary existence of just being this like prototypical middle American or middle class American guy, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of funny in retrospect. Now you think like some guy with like a well-paying job in a white picket house fence is like everyone's dream.
It's funny. My husband is from the Dominican Republic, and he always jokes. He jokes, obviously, but he says, you know, Canadians and Americans have way too much time on their hands. You know, all we think about back home is, are we going to eat today, and are we
Yep.
going to be able to do that? You know, and you know, there's obviously he says it in jest. Obviously, there's issues that people face, and in all
Yeah.
countries, but
I mean,
it's a good
I
point.
still have to kind of remind myself, like everything my parents went through, they're my parents, like they're still alive, like they were my age or younger than I am now than when all that stuff happened, right? And like here we,
Yeah.
whatever problems I've perceived to have today, pale in comparison to like people are coming to your house to kill you because of something that somebody else did, and you're just like tangentially involved, it's crazy.
Yes.
Um, but so about the visual storytelling stuff, it's kind of funny how things can represent things differently. Like we talk about the plastic bag in the context of that film being about like this fleeting nature of life. There's a very similar visual storytelling motif that happens in like in Forrest Gump, right? It's the floating feather,
Yes.
which represents the complete opposite, right? It's about this notion of questioning whether or not like life is predestined or is it about dealing with things as they come and everything's just kind of happening randomly, but they happen, to you. So like this represented by this floating feather that's just kind of carelessly in the wind, but then it happens to land at the feet of Forrest Gump, much like
Mhm.
the rest of his life, that all these like crazy things just happen to him, right? And it's like, well, was that because that's his destiny, or was just he always in the right place at the right time, or vice versa, right? And I think they even like mentioned that in the line in the movie. So yeah, that's what's so great about filmmaking, right? Like you find ways to not just share stories as like an experience of like then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, but really you get to dive deeper into provoking a lot of like introspection and questions and thoughtful kind of dialogue that can permeate through the experience. I think the best kind of film you can make is one that people still think and talk about after you're done watching it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, we do look for ways to try to incorporate some of that kind of storytelling in the work that we do at Kahani as well, because like that's the fun stuff.
Yeah, I would imagine it would be challenging, but that leads me to my next question actually about the craft of filmmaking. Um, I am not a filmmaker. My business partner and husband is studying it currently, as I've mentioned to you, and is loving it. Is doing some film and drone and everything, and just is all in on this, and I think it's great. Um, but it's challenging. It is challenging. Everything from pixelating the color to things that I would are way beyond my understanding. Um, did the craft itself come naturally to you, or did you find it challenging? Like, was this your destiny to be a filmmaker, do you think?
Oh, it was, I mean, I've been into filmmaking since I was like 8 years old. My dad
Okay.
brought home my camera, and since then I was like, you can do this. And like, I would watch like a James Bond movie and then go out with my friends to recreate it. And then we plug the tape in. And of course, it does not look anything like a James Bond movie. And I'd just be like, I'm like, "Oh, what did we get wrong?"
Yeah. Why does this look so different?
Did I just like, is there a setting on the camera that, and that's been the journey since then, right? It's still the pursuit. Um, and it's interesting too, actually. I found I was doing a project several years ago where I was trying to like take all the home videos that we have like on VHS and High 8 and all that, and I digitized them all and then cut them down to like a feature length version of like, here's my family history for the last 20 years in movie form. And
Wow.
one of the tapes I found was when I was in high school, I just had one tape because I didn't have any money, so I couldn't afford buying new tapes. So we just kept rewinding and re-recording over it. So there happens to be all this kind of mishmash of just like raw footage from all the silly movies that I would make with my friends when I was in school. And watching it, I was like, kind of flabbergasted after so many years of now being an experienced filmmaker, looking at the creative ways we were solving the same basic problems that I have to solve today as a filmmaker. Like, how do
Oh,
we make this? How does this shot connect with that shot so that when you cut them together, there's a congruent story being told. It's not jarring. Like, and so we were just figuring it out, and our intuition was, I'd say like 80% of the time was pretty good, right?
wow.
Without any formal training it was just from our own experiences of watching movies and knowing what we like and what makes sense in our head, right? And I feel like that's still mostly how I do it now. It's like it's a jigsaw puzzle in my head that I'm taking elements and all the different um, tools that I know are available to me and how they're going to plug together. I do all that math in my head, and then I'm like, what we need to shoot is like a close up of your hand holding the pencil like this. That's going to connect these two other shots together.
Right. So it's all here.
Kind of, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
there's obviously like a very technical aspect to it too, right? And I think that that often always becomes this like, again, this sort of dichotomy of um, how people approach the work. So there's the highly technical of like, you got to get the exposure right, you got to get the color balance right, or your choice in lensing and camera and makeup and wardrobe and all these things that create the image that is meant to be like the way that you're supposed to do it based on, the generations of the standards that have been set. But then there's also the creative side of things where it's like, hey, to tell this story the way we really want to, like maybe I want to see this a bit differently, or maybe like this shot isn't working. I have a really good example of this recently, actually. We were just on a shoot with someone. We're doing a project about fur farming in Canada and
Mm.
the fact that fur farms even exist and what have you. And we were doing an interview with someone who used to work on a fur farm and is now living with like post-traumatic stress from having to have killed so many animals in very brutal kind of ways and working in really just challenging work conditions with a lot of challenging people and just the level of stress and discomfort and what that experience can be like.
Yeah.
So we were setting up like in a separate room, we were setting up like where the interview was going to happen. So we were lighting it and doing it all, according to standard. And while he was waiting for us, he was just sitting in his kitchen. And I went out to go get him, and I just saw him sitting in his kitchen table, looking out the window. And the way that the light from the window was hitting him was just like this really beautiful and dark, kind of like it split his face in two and the shadow just
Mm.
fell in a certain way. And just seeing him framed by the window. And I'm just like, that's the shot. Hey, I just went back to the crew and I'm like, cancel everything we're doing. We're doing it over there. And just bring the
Wow.
camera, don't bring anything else. And we just sat down and did the interview there. And I still look back at that footage as we're going through it and I'm like, man, that looks good. I'm like that. And that it looks like a cinematographer really sat down and thought this through. And really it was just like, no, hey, it's happening naturally. And like that feels so much more correct for the story we're telling about this guy than like a proper sit down 3-point lighting setup kind of thing.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, I am a amateur photographer, but I studied journalism and did a little bit of study on it. And I just do it for fun and really passion. I go out to places and sometimes I come home and I haven't taken one photo because I just don't feel it. But sometimes I see something and I tell my husband, stop the car, and I get out and I'm in 6 feet in grass with the camera and it's like I just feel like I have to capture this because and that sounds like a similar type of a just impulse. You see it.
Well, yes. So here's what's interesting. I am terrible with taking photo, not terrible at taking photos. I'm pretty proud of what I can do, but I'm terrible at the practice of doing it outside of the context of work. Like if we're not working, I don't
Mhm.
want to touch a camera. I don't want to be one of those
Wow.
people that. And so, but when we are working and you're in that flow state, yeah, well, there's times where like especially like documentaries that are taking place in more rural places. I'll just be going down the highway and all of a sudden I see like the sun cracking through like a mountain peak or something like that with the clouds in a perfect kind of spot and the light and everything. And I'll just slam the brakes and whip out the camera and get a quick shot or get a time lapse, which is like there goes the rest of my evening, right? So like that definitely happens when we're filming, but when I'm not filming, the camera is put away. I can't be bothered to take any photos.
Yeah, when it's your craft, it kind of changes the dynamic of the experience. um I was saying to Andrew earlier before we started recording that when I was looking at his website, I had to actually stop because I was looking at so many of the work of his work that I wanted to ask questions about, 25 films, and that's not possible. So I am going to ask a question about a few of your pieces of work, and I just encourage you to visit the website, and I'll link to it below. Kahani Pictures. There's a lot of shorter, longer version films, just such a variety of stories to be told. And storytelling is something that I'm incredibly passionate about. I love to write lyrics and songs are a big thing for me. Like Zach Bryan has been on my radar for the past while. I don't know if you know him or not, but just the way that he's able to put something so complex into such simplicity is so impressive to me. I love to write, so that kind of thing. Your storytelling done visually, and I that's why I found it so challenging because there were just so many different types of stories, and they all matter, and they're all I wanted to touch them all, but I want to start by talking about this film. It's Indisposable, correct? That
Mhm.
you did with elementary school students. And this is a short film, and it's about elementary students who want to make change by reducing and encouraging the reduction of plastic waste and maybe even change policy. And one child was quoted as saying, when she's talking about all the work they're doing is advocacy in essence, and these are elementary school children, she says it's not that hard, all you have to do is set a goal. And I thought, wow, look at me, I'm about to cry, oh my gosh. That's wisdom. Like every adult should sit down with you for a minute. I was so impressed. Tell me what that experience was like filming with those kids.
Well, filming with kids is always great, right? I mean, they're so like unabashedly just themselves, and you don't have this like layer of defense that can often happen with folks when you bring a camera or when you're trying to tell their story, and there's always like this kind of skepticism as to what is happening here, and not even towards me. Like sometimes it's just like a self-inflicted thing where they're trying to show up all prim and proper, and they get in their head about it. Kids don't do that, right? Kids are just kids and they're very, playful, easy to work with, and I think like very excitable around what we're doing. So they're keen to like try interesting and new things. Um, yeah, Indisposable was actually a series of stories that we did in partnership with an organization out of the States that is advocating for like reuse over recycle. And so they were, yeah, looking for stories where I just basically kind of went up and down the California coast looking at different people doing interesting things and discovered this school teacher, Mrs. Omania, I think her name was, who this is like what she does is um, talk about like sustainability through the way that we interact with our things and trash and clean up and all that as like a part of everything they do. So like she incorporates it into like all the various lesson plans so that just being more mindful of waste is just something these kids are, experiencing in the classroom and then bringing that home with them too. So what was really fascinating was talking to a lot of the parents, in and around the filming and learning more about just like how much they've actually been incorporating what the kids are learning into their own lifestyle back at home. And it's like people talking about how like, oh, I never even thought about how we would go through like 6 or 7 2-liter Coke bottles in a week or something. Like, we've now reduced that to whatever. And so I thought like, how powerful is that? Like when your, elementary school kid is coming home and like actually uh, creating like change within the family, dynamic and how people work. And I think reacting to that positively for those families is so great too, because like, I think one of the best experiences for kids growing up, in my personal opinion, is for them to have a feeling of like responsibility within like, a community or especially a family structure. And
Yeah.
so if you're listening to their ideas and incorporating that into the way you do things, that is so empowering for them, right? Like that is giving them these core values in like dignity and self-respect and understanding that like they have a place. And I think it's just like it's, beyond the all the sustainability and climate implications to that. I just think like if you're raising better humans by offering them an opportunity to do something like that.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. What you say about children. It's what you see is what you get, right? There's no layer of, how am I presenting? What face am I putting on today? It's just kind of here I am, I'm showing up.
Well, it's a bit of a reflection of what's going on because I've been on sets where they had kids there that they were just really trying to force the kid to do what they wanted, and then you can totally see that the kid doesn't want to do that or want to be there, and we kind of want to pull them aside and be like, "What are we doing here?"
Yes.
And so that to me is just like an awareness thing. Like if you're working with children and they're not reciprocating the excitement of the work you're doing, like that's on you.
You're there for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so this story, I chose a few. There's no rhyme or reason really. I chose Wild Hearts, a film that you've done about the wild horses in the foothills of Alberta. I am an animal lover, so I chose that one to talk about with you briefly. It educated me hugely. I couldn't believe the stats. You can speak to that a bit here as you describe your work on that. And I also love how you made sure to incorporate the value that Indigenous people have for horses. So they're describing horses as animals that heal and protect, and such a vital part of that story that you captured. Um, can you speak to that film? And how do you must learn so much as you're doing this work?
Yeah. So Wild Hearts, we did in partnership with an organization called Zoo Check, and they're a nonprofit based out of Ontario that advocates for the protection of wildlife in Canada, which weirdly enough is like one of the most egregious countries when it comes to like the lack of protections for wildlife. You would think that Canada, of all places, that's like, we're so proud of our pristine nature and like the scenery
Yes.
and all that. But at the same time, there's a lot of just like looking the other way when it comes to things like the horse situation, which for anyone that doesn't know, there's small pockets of horse populations throughout Canada and in the foothills of Alberta, around the base of the Rocky Mountains in particular. There's also a lot of like crown grassland that many of the local ranchers like to take out their cattle to pasture and they graze across those grasslands. And so when they started to see some damage happening to the range, they were, just kind of like old men coming up with like excuses, started to blame the horses for being around and creating all this damage, that they were trampling the grass or eating all the grass. There's not enough to go around and it's causing trouble. And so the Alberta government for many years was actually doing roundups and culling the horses, and many of them were being sent to slaughter. And so looking into it, there was just like the decision to do that wasn't really based on any kind of scientific, rigor. It was just like, oh, we think there's horses, we think there's too many horses, so we got to kill them. And a lot of the work that ZooCheck does is actually quite litigious. So they were able to commission independent studies. They had different kinds of scientists, ranged, agronomists or not, well, range ecologists and other types of scientists come in and do like a range study to really determine the impact of the horses that are there. But then there's also this like, surplus of like traditional knowledge that comes from like the local indigenous communities, right? And so and which obviously does not ever get factored into like government decision making, right?
No.
We felt that it was imperative to make mention of that exists, and these people that have been here like forever would understand more than anyone the impact that like the ecosystem has when it's in balance, and who adds to that balance, and how the horses fit into that balance. And there's also, I don't think we mentioned this in the film, but there is one of the common arguments against having horses in the area is that they're not a natural species to the land, that they were brought in by settlers however long ago. And so the wild horses we see now are really just like feral horses from generations ago. But that also has been debunked by evidence of like indigenous peoples having brought horses over into the area back when there was like some like big sheet of ice that a lot of people moved over on. Don't know the full detail of that yet, but the idea is still there, being that indigenous peoples and their relationship to horses is like, goes eons beyond like what any kind of like studies around, or like stories rather, that come from the ranching community can compare to. And yeah, so working with indigenous peoples is always really interesting, because obviously like we talked a little bit about like exploitation and what that looks like, and in particular in storytelling, what that can look like. And I think amongst so many of the other things, indigenous stories and storytelling has also been something that's been quite exploited as a means of just like trying to either, there's someone that's trying to benefit from leveraging the experiences that indigenous people have gone through,
Yes.
or they're filtering it in a certain way that's to their own benefit, and or on the flip side of things, that they would use that story in a way to profit and not share that back with the community from whom the stories come from. And ownership of story is a really interesting conversation, and it's different within the context of indigenous peoples and kind of what we're used to here in like the Western or whatever we call ourselves. And so that's been quite an interesting learning journey for myself as well, is like how to approach these conversations when you want to include the indigenous perspective, how to be respectful and sensitive to the differences of opinion on like what a story even is and who tells it and how it's told. And I think that's an ongoing journey that continues to be quite interesting to me, and I look forward to like deeper collaborations with more indigenous creators, and in particular younger ones who like grew up with like the same similar experiences to what I had, and want to make the kind of films that we want to make, but then also come with this indigenous angle to it, that how do we how do we just collaborate on that more effectively?
Yeah, it's I mean, my hope, I try to have Indigenous guests on the podcast from various nations to learn from them, and to teach others from via their knowledge. And I work with an excellent client, and they are an Indigenous, all Indigenous team. And the reason that I mention them is that I am just constantly in a state of learning. as I service them, which is so interesting because I'm providing them with my expertise, which is PR and communications. But at the same time, I'm very, very cautious as to how things are done and how things are being communicated and who's saying what. And, I would never speak on their behalf, or, just examples of understanding, why is this meaningful? Why is this important? And some of the things that they tell me and knowledge that they share with me is just so incredibly valuable. And so it's a privilege to work with them. Access, they're a great group. So ditto to that. I mean, it's just Indigenous learning. My son is at an Indigenous led outdoor school right now, and he's learning quite a bit. So I'm happy with that. And so thanks for incorporating so much. I know there's one that you did with a young man. I think was it hoop dancing? He had
Yeah,
been in
Eli
recovery.
Gosling Rattlesnake, he is he's taught himself traditional hoop dancing and is like he's a very sort of prominent like role model in a lot of community spaces. So he travels and does hoop dance ceremonies and brings people into the culture and introduces more young people, which is great. Like you're starting to really see this like emerging like uh, youth activism around reconnecting to heritage, not just indigenous people, like I think all around the world, really, we're starting to see this like idea of like young people really wanting to connect to their culture from like a pre-colonial, pre-homogenization kind of perspective, but doing it in a way that's still modern and interesting and new and it's their own thing. So there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of really, really great like artists that are coming out of those kind of spaces.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we're going to see a lot from our Indigenous peoples here. Due to the fact that the youth, I don't know if people know this, but StatsCan is indicating that Indigenous youth are an incredibly high growing demographic. So, they outnumber the growth of other demographics by, I don't know how many percent, but it's significant. So, in 20 years from now, we're going to see a much, much larger Indigenous population here. So it'll be I think, a really fantastic dynamic. um, yeah, it's just a great learning, and I learned a lot watching a couple of your films, so thank you for that. I want to switch over to as a mother. This is the last film that I'll focus on. I stopped myself here. I'm a mother. I have a son who's biracial, and I also have, well, I have a son and a daughter who are biracial, and I have a son who is a boy of color. And my son is also neurodivergent. So when I saw your first episode of As a Mother, I was quite touched by it. It was done in partnership with VancouverMom.ca, I
That's
believe.
correct. Yeah.
And I saw pieces of my life in that. Struggles in the school system was one that really stood out. The mother's quote, she says the school had told her that something was wrong, because her son was, I guess, underperforming or not, achieving what he should be achieving in school. And her response was, when the school said something is wrong, she said, yes, it's you. And my husband and I looked at my husband, because I've said that to the school. I said, I'm not going to have my son conform to this. My son is the way he is, and he's beautiful that way. And I just watched this film of this brave woman telling the story of this beautiful child. And it really hit me. So do you feel inspired when you're doing films like that? How do you kind of, are you an emotional person? I mean, by that, I mean, do you carry that stuff with you as you go on? Um, or are you able to kind of, find ways to process it and kind of move forward a bit? Um, and, how do you choose these stories? How do you select them? I know some of them come to you. I know this is a very long-winded question, but how do like, that's a story I want to do. That's something I want to capture, because that was just such a powerful piece for me. It had race, it had, neurodiversity, it had mother, I'll stop now with the question.
Okay, so let me see if I can parse out the questions in that. So do I find do I find it inspiring, or how do I manage my emotions in in the telling of the stories, or like while we're working?
Yeah.
Um, to be quite honest, I feel like when we're in the work and we're in that sort of flow state mentality, it really to me is I'm putting, like I was describing before, it's like a jigsaw puzzle in my head. And I'm looking for elements of from like a technical angle, but also from an emotional angle. I'm looking for particular elements that I know are going to be necessary for me to have in like the editing room to be able to build this effectively. And so, not that I'm like prodding or anything like that, but I just know when like I know that something exists within a story, and I want to see if we can get it to, be represented on camera in an authentic way. So I'm kind of on a mission. And that's to say, like, I'm not necessarily sitting there emotionally kind of being swept by what's being said or what's being done, but rather I'm
Right.
like, okay, that's the piece I think we need. So great, we got that now. So let's move on. And I'll be quite regimented like that.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily hit me in that way. I think probably these stories don't really hit me that hard until like way after I'm done with the project. And then, months, if not years later, when I go back and watch something, and then I'm like, wow, this is really good. Or this is like,
Yeah.
yeah, I forgot that this even happened, right? So I think that's when I can watch it as like a typical audience person and not be in it. Then it triggers me in that emotional kind of way.
What brings forward, just to kind of remind you, because I asked you 5 questions in one, what brings forward kind of when you see an issue, an individual, um, a cause, a client, a potential client? What is it that brings, I want to I want to pursue this. Like, I really want to pursue this. Is there anything
Uh,
that draws you in?
yes. I mean, obviously some projects more than others have like drawn me in from that sort of conviction kind of level, but um, how I validate a project by way of knowing that we can do this and it's something that I care to do is there's a lot of discovery work that goes into these projects. Our process involves, it's a very front loaded, we call it the listening journey, where we go in and we really speak to as many people that are involved in the story as we possibly can and talk to people about the story from different angles and really leverage those conversations to A, build trust, right? We really want to build rapport with the folks that we're working with and get them to understand we're here for the right reasons. But B, we can triangulate what's true from like a thematic, emotional kind of level. Like what's the piece in all this that everybody remarked on that we saw that glint in their eye, right? So we're paying attention to these kind of markers for what's really working, and then that winds up being the thing we're like, that's one of the things we're looking for when we're then doing the actual filming. It's like I remember everybody said this thing, and I know it's important to you, so like let's figure out how you want that to be represented now that we're here with the camera. I don't necessarily say it like that, but that's kind of like my intention, right?
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, like when it's in those conversations that we're able to really dive deeper and then and figure out like, yeah, there's something here that works. And if there's something, if it's not there, that's also quite revealing, right? Then we can go back to, it's typically a client because we get commissioned to do the work. We can go back to the client and be like, look, we talked to like 12 different people and what you were saying, none of them brought it up. So
Mm,
you have a misunderstanding as to what the truth is on the ground.
that's interesting, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
eye opening for them.
Well, totally, right? And I don't, it's
Yeah.
never been that egregious, but definitely has been that there's like a difference of understanding. Often it's a very positive experience where they're like, "Oh, wow, we had no idea that that's like where this was going." And that's like my dream clients right now. I've got a couple of them that are just like, and again, here's a camera, here's some money. We don't want to touch it. We don't want to see it until it's done. We don't want to see how the sausage is made. We just want like we're fans of your work and we let and like and it blows us away that this is all in context of like the impact that we're making in the world. We had no idea, right?
Right.
So
Right.
that's always a fun experience.
Just so everyone knows, I have I call it the Kahani Films piggy bank, and I have it for saving up to work with Inder at some point because I just am such a admire your work. So I have a piggy bank started. I'll get there. I'll come with my piggy bank, and then you're gonna have to talk to a bunch of people. I'm scared of what you'll hear, but anyway.
I'm sure it'll be great. Well, that's just it too, right? The work that we do always winds up being like so much more of this like time capsule, like legacy building opportunity where people can really just sit back and appreciate, that impact that they're making in the world. It's not just about like like what we're doing isn't just like marketing or PR per se. It's deeper than that. And often a lot of that value that our clients find in the work that we do is beyond the putting it on their website. It's like showing it to their employees. It's showing it to their people throughout their supply chains and connecting everyone through this like shared sense of like impact and purpose, right? They're like, wow, we're actually making a difference. It really helps them to connect their workforce to the mission of their work. It's helping them for themselves to understand like, what we're doing is actually working in a meaningful way. You can feel proud about the work that you do. And and then, that can just be is and then it's there forever. Like it's not a fleeting thing. It's not social media content that just like disappears after 24 hours or in 24 minutes in this day and age, right? It's something that you can go back to and watch again and again. And so I think
Mhm.
that's like where I'm still trying to figure out how to like explain that like on our website.
No, I think it's done well. I think it's done well. Impactful storytelling, and it also has an element of journalism, like deep journalism. Like if a journalist had funds, which now they don't, right? But if
Right.
journalism had the funding to be able to dig deeper and the talent of a good filmmaker, there is a. Do you think there's a bit of journalism there too?
Yeah, yeah, I think there is. And I think it's also like, it's important work, especially for like, let's say a larger organization where they have like a real vested interest in impact, right? They've got an impact department and they've got like this whole ESG program that they've implemented and they have to report on it to their shareholders and things like that. And often those reports can be just like, here's the numbers. Like we spent this much and we built this many wells and we, donated this much money to these organizations. And here you can read their website bio if you care. And like that's just not super compelling. It's very mechanical, it's very transactional, and it's like it's not really connecting people to the work that you care to be doing. And then as soon as the mud hits the fan, that's like the first thing to get cut in terms of programming or funding or whatever. And it's important work. Or like people don't see the value of like expanding on the work because they're like, well, we're doing it and we hit these numbers and therefore that's it. And so I think a huge benefit to doing the storytelling that we do is providing that context of like why this impact is so important and why you need to consider like this being a core pillar of like the work that you do. And so to be able to go to where maybe you built one of these wells and again like the women in Ghana talk to them about how their lives have changed and how this is actually like sewing new, repairing the fabric of society in these places that have been traditionally damaged by exploitative industries coming in from the West. Like you're actually making a huge difference, not just for these people's lives, but in generations in the future. And you see that in the story that we told about this like mother and her child who gets to go to school and on and on and on and on, right? So I think that that is also like a huge aspect of the work that we do is not just like in creating a film that is going to be like this piece of media, but rather it's a way for organizations to have this like third party validation and authentication of the impact that they're doing, that it actually means something. It's not just numbers in a report.
Yeah, and a learning process for them, I imagine, as you're
Mhm.
gathering information from people through the film.
Yeah, and then also, it helps to like recontextualize like, and we can dive really deep into this stuff, right? Like there's so much around like how people in the corporate world are incorporating things like diversity and inclusion and equity and doing it from this very like again transactional kind of point of view of like, oh, we need to change. If we had X% more black and brown
Mm,
people in this level of like middle management, that'll solve this equity problem. And it's like that is so not the work that needs to be done, right? And
yeah.
so I think with the impact storytelling, like that's another way to kind of codify, like really showcasing and demonstrating like why the work is important and how deep the work needs to go, because you start to see uh, within these stories of people from different lived experiences, you see the humanity within them, and then you appreciate them in more, I'd say, authentic kind of ways, right? And so, and then hopefully that starts to shift the culture of the organization too, that the more that these people are your people and your leadership and your, employees are exposed to these experiences and stories, they start to feel more connected to them and then care more about how to move forward with this. And it becomes less about changing diversity points on a piece of paper and more about like, no, just when you're building new stuff, you're thinking about these people and you're thinking
Right.
about like it's inherent about how you want to build new systems so that, you know, more people are included in that dialogue in meaningful ways.
Yeah, I just wrote the word humanity in caps because I think that's a huge thing. We have such division. I feel like people have kind of, they've lost. I don't know if we've just what's happened with COVID, and then some of the political stuff, and humanity has just, and we see people on the streets and we just walk by, and these people are struggling and they're broken and but they're not broken, and they need you. Um, and when I say I had the piggy bank, I don't want to do a documentary about myself, God forbid. But my goal has always been to try to break down this stigma and the shame and the stereotype around substance use, because it's just so very dangerous and misguided, and deadly, to be frank. And so, I think that the humanity part of it is exactly right. Is, if we can bring people back to this, part of really, feeling and seeing a person for a person and a soul for a soul, one to one, and their story, and just thinking of walking in their shoes, what they've been through, and imagining that, which you're able to illustrate via your film. Humanity is really what I'm getting from this in the end, which is so vital right now, especially. I
Yeah,
feel like so.
I totally agree. And yeah, I think those are the types of films that I'm just called to make, at least at this point in my life, is that, matters of the human heart. And film is such a beautiful way to not just like create a connection between people and like other lived experiences, but to almost create like entire worlds for people so that you can better contextualize yourself into some of the decisions that some people make, and whether they're right or wrong decisions, at least you have a better understanding as to what led them to do that. And I think that that is like a core component to how we can start digging ourselves out of this hole that we've ironically through, mass production of really bite-sized digestible media have found ourselves in this like kind of culture war scenario that is seemingly only getting worse, as time goes on. But I'm one of those like, I don't know, hopeless romantics, I guess, thinking that, hey, the platform is just the platform. It's the way we used it that got us there. And that means that we could also swing the pendulum the other way. And if we start flooding it with like more thoughtful, emotional, heart to heart kind of storytelling, that might inspire others to do the same. And then we start to really like that becomes the culture, is that, we're sharing experiences rather than just like these really polarized opinions.
Yeah, yeah, and just ones that are kind of, just to bring on debate, which we have plenty of, enough of. I think we're past that. We should be past that. Um, Inder, I don't want to keep you all night here, but I have, two more small questions for you. What is something you have yet to do via film and storytelling that you really want to achieve? You've done so much. Just looking at the website, I know that there's a film coming up. You shared a small bit of it about South Asian international students, I believe it
Oh,
was.
that one's out. Yeah.
Oh, it is out. Okay. What was the name of it again?
So it's called Listen, or
Okay.
Suno, which is the Punjabi word for listen. And the tagline, I think, is like the struggles of female international students.
Okay.
And it's in particular about, yeah, much of the South Asian student population here in Canada. A lot of the young women are facing a relentless and very widespread epidemic, basically, of sexual violence and abuse, particularly being perpetrated from men within the community that they're meant to trust and are in positions of power over them. So people like their bosses, their landlords, even in schools in some cases, like their peers or people in social groups with high social standing. And it's become quite prevalent and just very not talked about because of uh, a myriad of reasons, but which we go through in the film. But this has been a really um, interesting experience and example of like the power of what films can do, because just this film alone, as we've been touring it and doing community screenings, it's actually been galvanizing a lot of dialogue around the issue. And we just last week, I think Trisha, my wife and partner in all this, she was invited to go demonstrate the film and speak to it at a women's only gathering in that was facilitated actually by the city of Surrey. And
Fantastic.
so the city is actually putting programmatic, and resourcing into like solutionary kind of work towards building like ways for people to reach out and be seen and heard and understand their rights and access resources and things like that. And there were women coming out to that event where they felt so like here's an issue that I'm experiencing that I have no one to turn to talk to about, and I have no idea what I can do about this. And now I have this community of people that will hear me and offer me support. And there's a whole like there were like pro bono lawyers that were there telling them about like what they can be doing and how to actually action on this from a legal perspective. There was like counselors that were there ready to take people on to like support them through their journey and
Amazing.
it was like such a wonderful outcome, unfortunately, because of like the prevalence of the issue, but the film being this like conduit to bring people together and to accomplish that. So we're very, I mean, this is like one of those bittersweet things. Like I hate that I had to make the movie,
Yeah.
but we're glad to know that it's effective and we're seeing it being shared through like different social channels. There's a prominent podcast that picked it up and brought a huge audience to it, and so we're starting to see it making a difference.
Amazing. So you feel like you're right where you should be at this point in time when it comes to your storytelling.
Well, I still haven't made that James Bond movie. Uh,
Oh, darn. So
so
that's next.
yeah, I that's the one thing I haven't done yet is like dip my toe in that traditional model of like scripted cinema with some kind of like a just narrative, whatever. And we were talking about this before the recording started, but now that I've been taking some acting classes to better appreciate the craft of acting and what that brings to the storytelling, so maybe I'll be compelled now to like go shoot a short film or something that's just some random story we came up with rather than it being like some gut punching emotional uh, telling of a real story.
Yeah, I mean, you'll finish your acting. My husband will finish film, and he'll be filming you, and you'll be on the screen, and there you go.
Amateur hour.
Yeah, there you go. No, but you guys will be great.
Yeah.
I end every conversation, Inder, with asking about my guests' favorite nonprofit. I think it's just important to highlight one or two that guests are passionate about or want to share. So, is there one or two that you wanted to share with the listeners today?
I've got like one or 200 I could share. A
I
lot of nonprofits and
was only allowed to do 3 films, so
I would, if I'm going to give a shout out to anybody, I want to give a shout out to A Better Life Foundation. They're focused on food security in the downtown east side of Vancouver, and they have a number of programs that collectively, I'm going to get the numbers wrong. I think it's that they send out like 1,600 meals per day using recovered food. So food that was going to be thrown out by restaurants or grocery stores or whomever, they're able to safely and effectively repurpose them into delicious meals that get sent out to the folks within the downtown east side community. And they also have this really interesting program called Plenty of Plates, where do
yes,
you know what that is, right?
yes,
Yeah. So for the audience, for anyone that knows Save on Meats, the diner is still a fully functioning diner, and the kitchen is where they do all their meal prep on a daily basis. But folks like you and I can offer to bring a small cohort of friends, family, coworkers, like some kind of a small team in to do a facilitated um, cooking experience where you work in their kitchen. It's an industrial kitchen. You cook up a 3-course meal, and they invite people from the downtown East Side community into the diner. They all come in and they have this full restaurant experience, and it would be you and your friends going out there and serving them.
Very
And
cool.
it's so much more meaningful than just some like soup kitchen kind of vibe where you're just like, people are in a line and you're plopping food in their plate, but rather you're creating a like delicious gourmet meals, fully facilitated. You don't have to know how to cook. Like they'll show you what to do. They're simple enough that anyone can do them. And then the service piece, like you're going out there and actually serving the food and like, having to have these conversations and being in this like total flip of like social power dynamic where now you're in service of these folks that maybe, on your way over there, you wouldn't like look at them in the eye, like, no judgment, but everybody does that.
Yeah.
And it totally, going back to that idea of like the humanizing, experiences, it just like breaks down those barriers instantly and
Mm.
reminds you that like, people are people, and like the reasons why people might be here could be just a stone's throw away from, you making similar decisions, and or it's, a circumstance that you can totally empathize with, and it's just a matter of speaking to them and or serving food to them. And it's just such a fun, amazing experience that I think is it's probably more meaningful for the volunteers than it is for, it's great for the community people too, because like there's music and it's delicious 3-course meals. They get these like desserts and it's great. And so you're talking about food sovereignty, food security, repurposing food, and then also talking about breaking down social barriers and norms. And it's just like all happens within a span of like 3-4 hours in one evening. It's really, really great.
It's amazing. Yeah, I'll link to this below, so that listeners can have a look and hopefully participate. And
And
yeah,
if it's
try to get eye
videos on that
contact.
too.
What's that? You did a video, or you were going to?
Yeah, we've done a couple of videos of a Plenty of Plates night, so you can actually see like what
Oh,
the experience is like. I'll send the link to you.
that would be excellent. I'll link to those too. Thank you so much. Inder Nirwan has been here today, filmmaker and owner of Kahani Pictures. Um, Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about your process, your storytelling. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for bringing. Thank you for bringing stories to people in a way that they won't forget and that may hit them in a way that may create change. And that's not easy. Um, and thank you for making me cry. Because if it's happy tears, then it's all good. But yeah, check out. I'll include Inder's social media information and website for Kahani Pictures, linked with the episode. It'll be live next week. And yeah, I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast today, Inder. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate the recognition and everything you said. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Be kind and truly connect. You're listening to Rachel Thexton Connects.